Again, my name's Aaron Koelker, and I'm one of the editors for Atlas of Design Volume 6, which is myself, NACIS, Josh Ryan, and Tracy Etienne. We're all here somewhere. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about the Atlas itself today, because I think most of you are probably familiar with it by now. But real quick, in case you're new, the Atlas is published every 2 years by NACIS. And it's made possible by a bunch of dedicated volunteer editors, translators, judges, and of course you all, and cartographers outside of this community who send in their maps to be considered for each volume. The purpose of the Atlas is to promote the field of cartography and to kind of give readers some insight into the types of design decisions that go into crafting a map. And then real quick, I'm sure you all know by now, Volume 6 is available now. If you pre-ordered Volume 6 or any of the other volumes and chose to pick up that NACIS option, we've been over at the table by registration each morning. If you haven't picked it up yet, please come by and grab your copy. So for Volume 6, we had over 200 maps submitted, which was less than the past couple of volumes. However, we were really happy with the quality of maps that we received. And this year, or this volume, we had a new question on our submission form, which was asking folks to give us their personal thumbnail definitions of a design and how that related to their map. And we did this so that we could get a bit of additional insight into kind of what that person or group might write about in their commentary if their map was selected. But once we got all those responses in and saw all these unique definitions, we realized we had this pretty cool data set on our hands. And right around that time, Daniel Huffman, who I'm sure many of you know, was one of the first editors for the Atlas and was a judge on this volume. He had reached out and kind of saw the same thing and had the great idea to or a great suggestion of doing a presentation to kind of share a lot of those definitions and ideas. And so here we are. So starting with kind of all the raw text that was submitted, there were over 18,000 words, which isn't a ton to read through, and I did, but if we want to start kind of pulling that apart and comparing, what are most common word choices or ideas that show up in these things, that would be really tedious to do manually. And so we can turn to something called natural language processing to help us out. And you could have an entire presentation or even a class just on this. But essentially, in a nutshell, it is teaching humans to understand, or teaching computers to understand kind of all the intricacies and nuances of language in the same way that humans do. So, for example, if we're thinking of like parts of speech, like verbs and nouns, and I tell you to think of what is the part of speech of the word design, some of you might have thought noun, you might have thought verb, some of you might have thought adjective, and it can be all of those things, right? It just depends how those words are being used in a sentence. And getting a computer to understand that can be very tricky. But fortunately, there are a lot of awesome libraries and algorithms that people have shared for things like R or Python that we can leverage and apply to our own text. I'm more of a Python person, and I ended up using the NLTK library, but there are tons of great ones out there if you want to poke around. But before we get to all that, we have to do everyone's favorite part of any project, which is data cleanup. So a lot of the submissions we got were like in French or Spanish or Portuguese. Wanted to translate those first. Getting the text out of our submission form, there were kind of some special characters and coding issues that had to be taken care of. Folks could submit more than one map, and sometimes they just copied and pasted their response between the two, so we wanted to remove the duplicates. We needed to standardize spellings, fix typos, misspellings, did some really light grammatical fixes just because if we're trying to get a computer to understand language, we need to be giving it good grammatically correct examples of language. And then took out responses that didn't actually address that prompt. At that point, I kind of realized I was really just interested in those thumbnail definitions, and so I went in and started pulling those out from each of the responses. And in some cases, it was just a matter of copying and pasting. In other cases, their definition was kind of woven in and out of a bunch of other stuff. So I tried to go in and create as concise of a definition from their response as I could, being very careful not to add or remove kind of any meaningful words. And then at this point, also realized that apparently our prompt was a bit open to interpretation, because we had a bunch of definitions defining design, and then a bunch specifically defining map design, and I wanted to split those up. So that left us with 84 definitions of design, 52 for map design, 136 total, and got us all the way down to 2,300 words. So one of the most, I guess the first things, or the most basic things we can do is just, what were the most common word choices people were using in their definitions? And looking at this chart, hopefully the text is big enough, you might notice that a lot of these words don't really mean anything on their own. In natural language processing, these are referred to as stop words, and we would typically just remove them unless you're specifically looking at something to do with those. But we can go ahead and remove all of those most common ones, like the, and is, and that gives us something like this. And you'll notice now on the left-hand side, we have this huge skew for design and map, and that's because all of the definitions are either going to have one or both of those words in some combination. So in our case here, those are also stop words for our specific project, since having them in this count doesn't really tell us much. So we can remove those. And now we're getting there, but you might notice that some of these words, so we have like making and make and creating and create, both on here, which are essentially the same word, and we don't need to see every kind of different tense or ending for that word. And so we can use something called either stemming or lemmatizing, which essentially do the same thing, but they will take these words and look at the context and chop them down into their base form so we can combine them. And if we have like singular and plural words like map or maps with an S on the end, it'll chop those down to their singular form too. And so then we get this, and now you can see that make and create are now, those are the two most used words after we combine all the different versions of them. From there, we can start breaking them out into the words into their parts of speech, again, taking into context how they were actually used in the definitions. So for example, on the left-hand column there for nouns, we have form about halfway down, which I would think of a verb as at first, but here it's most often being used like in the phrase form and function as a noun. And then on the right, personally, I think that this is where the interesting words start to come up in the adjectives there. And those were the top ones that people were using. From there, we can go on and use something called n-grams, n being any number. And essentially, it's finding sequences of words next to each other and looking for repeated instances of that to try and find common phrases or the relationships between words, not just how often people are using them. And so if we take an example sentence here, up until now, we've been using unigrams, which is just each word on its own. If we were doing bigrams, it would be each pair of adjacent words. So each word would show up twice. You can do trigrams with 3, quadgrams with 4, and et cetera, kind of with diminishing returns on how often you're going to get multiple hits on those. And so if we look at the top bigrams for our definition, here I put map and design back into the list of words so we can see how they're actually being used in relation to other words. But now we can kind of start to get a sense of the common ideas that are showing up in a lot of these definitions. We can then take those bigrams and the frequency with which they occurred and graph them out visually like this. And so this is showing Each word that is connected with a line means they're frequently being used together. And so now we can get even a little bit more insight into sort of the common ideas or I guess turns of phrase that people are coming back to again and again in their definitions. I think though that, so all that's great, but I think really to get the best sense of these, you do just kind of have to read them. So if you haven't seen it already, over in the map gallery, there are two big pink posters that has all of the definitions listed on there anonymously, and I invite you all to go check them out. I think they're really interesting, and you'll probably see a bunch that you strongly agree with, and you might see some that you disagree with. But it's interesting kind of to see all the different things this one word or term kind of means to our peers. And so that's all I got, short and sweet. Here's some contact information if you want to reach out to either me or the editors. And thanks so much for your time.
We do have time for a couple of questions. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. My question for you is this, comparing the maps in Volume 6 of the Atlas to the maps in Volume 1, I noticed a lot more hand-drawn, sort of pictorial, illustrated maps. And I'm curious if you can comment on whether that is emblematic of broader trends amongst all the submissions, or perhaps trends in cartography at large, or whether that's more a reflection of perhaps the editors and judges' personal preferences or interests?
Well, it's probably all of those things. I think we probably got a higher, ratio of hand-drawn maps for this volume. We do grab a new kind of panel of judges for each volume, and we want them to bring all of their own kind of personal, opinions and biases on what, makes good design. And so if they were kind of feeling the hand-drawn maps more, that might kind of factor into that. I don't know how many in past volumes in terms of like submitted maps that were hand-drawn that weren't included, so I don't know how the numbers compare there, but I hope does that kind of answer your question? Okay.
Are there any other questions? All right. Matt.
I just wanted to ask, what is your favorite definition of the ones that came in?
My favorite definition? I'm personally a fan of just any of the ones that incorporate design, the balance of form and function. There were several of those. I think a lot of people kind of fall back on that, or like that one as well. That's mine too, I think.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for attending the last session of the day. And don't forget,